The phrase, "This is a witch hunt," struck the Senate chamber with the familiar impact it always carried whenever Ilhan Omar uttered it, driven by the weight of absolute moral conviction. It possessed the rhythm of someone previously persecuted who had endured, the volume of a woman taught from youth that silence equates to death. This is a targeted persecution of the Somali community. You are singling out Muslim Americans, and you are utilizing this committee and this chamber to outlaw an entire demographic. This constitutes Islamophobia, and every citizen observing this spectacle should be horrified by the actions this administration is undertaking. She stood tall, though witnesses at Senate inquiries are generally expected to remain seated. Yet Ilhan Omar had never been particularly concerned with expectations. She leveled a rigid finger at the man occupying the presiding officer's seat, her voice saturating the Russell Senate office building with the rehearsed indignation that had rendered her the most renowned and divisive figure in the House. The figure in the chair was the Vice President of the United States, J.D. Vance, who sat with his hands clasped upon the desk before him. He offered no reaction to the finger, nor did he respond to the volume, nor did he adjust his posture or reach for water, or consult his legal team, or perform any of the fidgets people display when being yelled at. He remained seated in the manner of a man raised in a home where shouting was the standard, where his mother's boyfriend screamed, and his mother screamed in return, and the police arrived and departed only to arrive again. The sole individual who never raised her voice was his grandmother, who spoke softly because she had learned in the mountains of eastern Kentucky that quiet people are the ones who command attention. He waited until Omar concluded her tirade and allowed the silence to descend, letting it hang for 2 or 3 seconds, just long enough for the C-SPAN feeds to capture the disparity between her rage and his stillness. Then he began to speak, and his voice carried the intonation of Southern Ohio, Appalachian at the fringes and unhurried, the voice of a man who had authored a bestseller about his own destitution and understood how to wield a narrative the way an attorney wields evidence. "Congresswoman Omar," he began, "I value your presence here today. But before we move forward, I wish to share something with the committee that is not included in the briefing materials. It is personal." He paused, not for the sake of theatrics, but for the sake of memory. "I grew up in Middletown, Ohio, where my mother battled addiction to OxyContin and heroin, cycling through rehabilitation, relapse, boyfriends, and evictions so frequently that I ceased keeping track by the time I turned 12. My father relinquished his parental rights before I was old enough to comprehend the implications, so I lived with my grandmother, a woman named Bonnie Vance, whom everyone addressed as Mama. She had departed the hills of Jackson, Kentucky, with an 8th-grade education and a temper capable of peeling paint, because she was the solitary adult in my life who remained sober long enough to ensure my safety. I consumed government cheese, I wore footwear from Goodwill, and I ate school lunches because that was often the most substantial meal I would receive that day. My town was collapsing, with steel mills shuttering and the opioid epidemic shattering families, while people I grew up alongside overdosed in restrooms and parking lots. I watched these events unfold because I lived inside them. And I am not lecturing you from a position of privilege, Congresswoman, but asking you from the very place you originated. I speak from poverty, from struggle, and from a system that abandoned people like us. Yet the distinction between us is not where we began, but what we did with the chance America provided. When this country offered me an opportunity, I donned a Marine Corps uniform and deployed to Iraq, whereas when this country offered you an opportunity, you utilized your seat in Congress to describe the September 11th attacks as "some people did something." You compared the United States military to the Taliban, and authored a bill that was exploited to commit $250 million in fraud. I am not targeting your religion, nor am I targeting your community. But I am asking you what your constituents in Minneapolis are asking. What did you do with the opportunity this country granted you? He asked, followed by a silence that recalibrated the room. It was the sort of silence where 40 senators and 200 spectators and a dozen cameras simultaneously realized that the hearing they anticipated was not the hearing they were about to witness. To comprehend how they reached this moment, with the vice president and a congresswoman from Minnesota's 5th District sitting across from one another in a chamber of marble and mahogany, you must return to the morning. You have to go back to the hours prior, when both of them still believed they understood how this encounter would conclude. Ilhan Omar arrived at the Russell Building at 8:15, flanked by her attorney, her chief of staff, and 2 communications staffers who had spent the preceding 72 hours preparing what they termed the playbook. The playbook was straightforward because it had always succeeded, based on the premise that when Republicans attack Ilhan Omar, the attack is invariably focused on her identity. She is Muslim, she is Somali, she is an immigrant who wears a hijab, and she represents a district that Republicans delight in demonizing. Every attack, regardless of its stated topics such as financial disclosures or campaign finance or foreign policy or the Feeding Our Future scandal, is fundamentally about who she is rather than what she has done. The defense against an identity attack is an identity defense, her attorney Rachel Stein, a former DOJ prosecutor who had steered through numerous congressional investigations, had explained. They will attempt to link you to the fraud through the Meals Act using standard guilt by association, and we will respond that the bill was designed to feed children during a pandemic. The fraud was perpetrated by criminals who exploited a program, and the suggestion that you are responsible for the actions of criminals follows the same logic that blames every Muslim for the actions of terrorists. Then they will pivot to your public statements like, "Some people did something," or the IPAC tweet or the Taliban comparison, but these are old news, and every one of them has been litigated in the media for years. We do not relitigate, we redirect. Because this hearing is ostensibly about fraud in federal programs and not about tweets from 2019. If Vance gets personal, he will not succeed, Stein said, noting that he is the vice president and must maintain decorum. So he will ask procedural questions and allow Republican senators to handle the attacks. Omar scrolled through her phone where the squad group chat was already buzzing with AOC posting support, Presley messaging solidarity, and Clyburn sharing a thread about Islamophobic rhetoric in congressional hearings. The hashtag #ProtectIlhan was trending upward. The fundraising emails were queued, and the machine was operating exactly as it always worked. Every Republican hearing transformed into a fundraising cycle, a media tour, and a renewal of the narrative that the refugee girl survives war, survives camps, survives Trump, and survives the right-wing machine. The attacks made her stronger, which was the entire model. But what Omar's team had not prepared for was an opponent who could match her poverty story with his own. They had researched Vance, naturally, noting Yale Law and venture capital, and Peter Thiel and his rise to senator and vice president, seeing the profile of a man born into the Republican establishment who wrote a book about poor people to enrich himself. That was the frame, that Vance is a wealthy Ivy League politician exploiting his own community's suffering for profit, who now presumes to lecture an actual refugee about struggle. What they hadn't read, or hadn't read closely enough, was the book itself, and they hadn't internalized the mother overdosing in the Walmart parking lot, or the father who signed away his rights. They overlooked the grandmother who carried a revolver in her purse, and once threatened to kill a man who struck her daughter. and the kid who arrived at Marine Corps basic training unaware of how to balance a checkbook. They knew the title Hillbilly Elegy and the criticism that it blamed the poor for their own poverty, but they didn't know the story, and the story was the weapon. 3 blocks away, in a secure office within the Eisenhower Executive Office Building, J.D. Vance sat with his chief of staff and legal counsel reviewing a notably thin folder. It was thin not due to a lack of research, which they had done extensively, but because the folder contained almost no financial data, no spreadsheets, and no FEC filings. Those were Speaker Johnson's tools, as Johnson had already dismantled Omar's financial narrative in his own hearing months earlier by reading the disclosure jump into the record with the clinical precision of a tax accountant. That territory was already claimed, so Vance's folder contained transcripts, tweets, video timestamps, and the public record of Ilhan Omar's own words. It focused not on her finances, but on her statements, the things she had said on camera and on social media and in speeches she chose to deliver about the country that had adopted her. She is going to play the identity card regarding Islamophobia and xenophobia and targeting immigrants, said his chief of staff, a former Marine officer named Kevin Gallagher. I know, Vance said, and it is going to bounce off me like a rubber ball off a brick wall, because I am not attacking her identity, but reading her words. She will say you are privileged and cannot understand what a refugee goes through, and Vance almost smiled, remarking that he grew up in Middletown, Ohio. My mother stuck a needle in her arm every night. My father did not exist, and I wore second-hand shoes and ate government cheese and joined the Marines because I didn't know what else to do with my life. I am the least privileged person in that building tomorrow, and everyone in America who read my book knows it, he said as he opened the folder. On the first page was a transcript of Omar's CARE speech from March 2019, where the relevant passage highlighted her claim that CARE was founded after 9/11 because they recognized that some people did something and all of us were losing access to civil liberties. I enlisted because of 9/11, Vance said quietly, noting that a lot of kids did and some of them didn't come home. Yet she called it, "Some people did something." I'm going to read that back to her, and then I am going to tell her about Mama, my grandmother, Bonnie Vance, who left Kentucky at 13 with an 8th-grade education. She worked in factories her whole life and never complained about America, not once, because she remembered what it was like to have nothing and never forgot that this country gave her a chance. He closed the folder, saying Omar came here as a refugee and his grandmother came to Middletown as a hillbilly, which is the same story with a different ending. I am going to let America see both endings and decide which one they respect, he told Gallagher, who asked if he was going to attack her. No, I am going to tell a story, 2 stories, and the gap between them is going to do all the work. The hearing began at 10 o'clock under the official title Oversight of Federal Nutrition Programs, examining the Feeding Our Future fraud and systemic vulnerabilities in pandemic-era spending. The title was designed to sound bureaucratic, but the content would prove to be anything but, even though the first 2 hours were purely procedural. Witnesses from the Department of Agriculture, the Government Accountability Office, and the FBI's Minneapolis field office testified about the mechanics of the Feeding Our Future fraud. They explained how organizations had submitted claims for millions of meals that were never served, and how the money had been laundered through shell companies and real estate purchases and wire transfers to overseas accounts. 70 people had been charged and more than 50 convicted in what federal prosecutors called the largest pandemic fraud in American history, with numbers reaching a staggering $250 million stolen from a program designed to feed children. The organizations were mostly clustered in Minneapolis's Cedar Riverside neighborhood, the heart of the Somali American community that Omar represented. Though the founder of Feeding Our Future, Amy Bach, was white and had been convicted at trial. Omar listened to the testimony with the practiced stillness of a politician who has been investigated before, while her attorney took notes and her staff monitored social media. The hearing was proceeding as expected, dry and procedural and damaging, but manageable, until it was her turn to testify. She took her seat at the witness table and delivered an opening statement that was 7 minutes long, eloquent, and built on the foundation that had sustained her career. "I was born in Mogadishu, Somalia," she said, explaining she spent 4 years in a refugee camp in Kenya and came to this country as a 12-year-old girl who spoke no English. "I have been investigated, attacked, threatened, and vilified since the day I took office, and I am here today because the majority party has decided once again to use the suffering of my community as a political weapon." She looked at Vance and accused him of being a man born with every advantage who dared to use the committee to target a refugee and a Muslim woman because doing so served his political agenda. "This hearing is not about fraud," she declared, "but about fear of immigrants and Muslims and a black woman who dares to speak truth in halls built for people who look like you." The gallery stirred as progressive groups in the back rows nodded, and Omar's staff exchanged satisfied glances because the playbook was working. She had framed the hearing as an identity attack before a single substantive question had been asked. But Vance waited and let the statement settle the way his grandmother had taught him. "Congresswoman," he said, "I need to correct something you said because you described me as a man born with every advantage, and I want to make sure the record is accurate. I was born in Middletown, Ohio, not the good part, but the part where the Armco steel mill used to be before it closed and took the town's economy with it. My mother, Beverly, was addicted to heroin and OxyContin, and she didn't cycle through rehab once or twice, but 18 times, a fact I know because I counted. When you are a kid and your mother goes away, you count the times because counting gives you the illusion that there is a pattern and that maybe this time is the last time. It wasn't, and my father signed away his parental rights, which I say not with anger, but as a fact. By the time I was in middle school, I had lived in 4 or 5 different houses, depending on which boyfriend my mother was with, and the only constant in my life was my grandmother. Mama had come to Middletown from Jackson, Kentucky, at 13 years old with nothing, no money, no education past 8th grade, and no connections, just a willingness to work in a factory. She thanked God every night that she lived in a country where a hillbilly girl from Kentucky could do that, while I wore shoes from Goodwill and ate school lunch because it was my biggest meal. I joined the Marine Corps in 2003 because I didn't know how to fill out a college application, and the recruiter said the Marines would teach me how to be an adult. He paused to adjust his microphone slightly, not out of nervousness but for emphasis, employing a storyteller's timing. "So when you say I was born with every advantage, Congresswoman, with deep respect for everything you survived as a child, you are talking to someone who also survived. We had different countries, but the same poverty, the same broken adults, and the same fear that tomorrow would be worse than today. The difference between us isn't where we started, because we both started at the bottom. But the difference is what we chose to do with the chance America gave us." The room shifted, not with the dramatic shift of a courtroom revelation, but with the quiet shift of an audience recalculating its assumptions. Omar had entered the hearing room as the underdog refugee versus the powerful vice president, but in 90 seconds, Vance had collapsed that frame. He wasn't the powerful man attacking the vulnerable woman. He was the other poor kid asking a question that had nothing to do with identity and everything to do with choices. Omar's attorney wrote a note on her legal pad and slid it across the table, but Omar glanced at it without acknowledging it and spoke with a tighter voice. Mr. Vice President, she said, your personal story is compelling, but it doesn't change the fact that this hearing is being used to target a congresswoman. I'd like to discuss some of the things you've said during your time in Congress, he replied, clarifying that he meant her words on the record and not what others said about her. He opened his folder to the first tab, noting that on March 23, 2019, she gave a speech at a fundraising event for the Council on American Islamic Relations. In that speech, you described the founding of CARE and its connection to the September 11th attacks, and your exact words were that some people did something. He looked up from the transcript to remind her that 2,977 people died on September 11, 2001. Firefighters ran upstairs that they knew they wouldn't come down from. Office workers called their families to say goodbye from burning buildings, and passengers on Flight 93 stormed the cockpit because they decided to die fighting. The towers came down, the Pentagon burned, and a field in Pennsylvania became a graveyard. Yet you described it as some people did something. Congresswoman, I enlisted in the United States Marine Corps in 2003 when I was 18 years old because of what happened on September 11th. We didn't enlist for money or for college, though the GI Bill changed my life, but we enlisted because some people did something to our country and we wanted to do something back. I went to Iraq as a combat correspondent with the 2nd Marine Aircraft Wing at Al-Assad Air Base, carrying an M16 and a camera to write stories about the Marines I served with. Some of those Marines went to places I didn't go, and some of them didn't come home, and every one of them enlisted because terrorists murdered nearly 3,000 Americans. You have every right to criticize American foreign policy, and I exercise that right myself, as I've said publicly, that the Iraq War was a mistake, and have been critical of the war on terror's excesses. Dissent is patriotic, but when you describe the worst attack in American history as some people did something, you are not dissenting, but diminishing. Omar leaned forward to argue that she was talking about the impact on Muslim American civil liberties after 9/11, including the surveillance and the profiling. Then say that, Vance said, say the 9/11 attacks were horrific and the response unfairly targeted Muslim Americans, and I would agree with and support that statement. But that is not what you said. You said some people did something, and the families of 2,977 people heard you choose those words. He turned to the next tab regarding a statement she posted on Twitter on June 7, 2021, and read it exactly as it appeared. We must have the same level of accountability and justice for all victims of crimes against humanity, and we have seen unthinkable atrocities committed by the U.S., Hamas, Israel, Afghanistan, and the Taliban. You put the United States of America in the same sentence as Hamas and the Taliban, the country that took you in as a 12-year-old refugee. It gave you citizenship and a congressional seat, yet you placed it alongside terrorist organizations that stone women, execute homosexuals, and ban girls from attending school. I served in the Marine Corps with men and women who fought the Taliban and carried their wounded out of firefights, and you told the world that their country commits the same unthinkable atrocities as the people they were fighting. 12 members of your own party condemned you, not Republicans, but Jewish Democrats who found the equivalence offensive and dangerous. And Speaker Pelosi issued a statement saying, your comparison foments prejudice. You didn't apologize, but instead clarified, and there is a difference between apologizing and clarifying, because apologizing means you understand what you did wrong. Clarifying means you think the problem is that people misunderstood you, but they didn't misunderstand you. They read your words perfectly. Omar's composure held, but her rhythm had changed, as she was no longer performing the measured outrage of a prepared witness, but was reacting. "You are taking my words out of context to serve a political purpose," she insisted. But Vance countered that he was reading her words in full, without editing or paraphrasing. "If the context changes, the meaning, please provide it," he offered. But she didn't provide it because there was no context that made the sentence read differently. The words were the words, and Vance continued with a voice that hadn't changed, utilizing the steady, warm Appalachian tone of a man telling a story he'd been thinking about for a long time. In February 2019, you tweeted that congressional support for Israel was all about the Benjamins, and when asked who you were referring to, you responded with a single word: AIPAC. The implication that Jewish money controls American politics is one of the oldest and most destructive anti-Semitic tropes in existence, used for centuries to justify persecution. The House voted to pass a resolution condemning anti-Semitism, and your own leadership publicly called on you to apologize, which you did. But then you were removed from the Foreign Affairs Committee. You demand rightly that Americans take Islamophobia seriously, and I take it seriously because it is real and harmful, but you cannot demand tolerance for yourself while trafficking in prejudice against others. You cannot ask America to protect your community while you deploy tropes that have been used to harm the Jewish community for 1,000 years. Omar's attorney placed a hand on her arm as a signal not to respond and to move to the next topic, but Vance was already there. "Now I want to talk about why we are actually in this room today, focusing on the $250 million rather than your tweets." He pulled a document from his folder containing a timeline and names drawn from federal court records, noting that in 2020, she authored the Meals Act. The purpose was to expand access to child nutrition programs during the pandemic, which is a good goal, but the bill reduced oversight requirements and expanded the number of organizations that could access funding. Critics warned that the reduced safeguards could be exploited, yet you pushed the bill forward. And what happened next is the subject of the largest pandemic fraud prosecution in history. Feeding Our Future, a nonprofit operating in your district, submitted claims for millions of meals that were never prepared, and the money was laundered through shell companies to purchase luxury cars. More than 70 people have been charged, the majority being members of the Somali American community you claim to protect, and some even donated to your campaign. In December, the Treasury Department announced an investigation into whether any of the stolen funds were channeled to Al-Shabaab, the Al-Qaeda affiliate in Somalia. He let that sentence settle, emphasizing that money stolen from a program she authored might have flowed back to fund the very violence she had escaped. When CBS asked you about the potential terrorism connection, you said any link between the alleged fraud and terrorism would be a failure of the FBI. Congresswoman, when I was in Iraq, we had a saying that every dollar we lose is a bullet someone else buys, and if even a fraction of that money reached Al-Shabaab, then a program designed to feed American children funded an organization that murders African children. And the congresswoman who authored that program looked at the camera and said it was the FBI's fault, causing Omar to break forward into the fight. "This is racist and Islamophobic," she shouted, accusing him of targeting a Muslim black immigrant woman because he cannot accept that someone like her has a voice in government. "You are criminalizing my community and demonizing immigrants," she continued, calling him a man who wrote a book about how poor white people deserve sympathy while immigrants deserve suspicion. "You have the audacity to sit there and lecture me about gratitude," she exclaimed as the hearing room crackled and Democratic senators shifted uncomfortably. The accusation of racism from a congresswoman to a vice president was the political equivalent of a grenade with the pin pulled. But Vance didn't flinch. He sat the way he learned to sit in Middletown when the shouting started, still and patient, waiting for the storm to pass. When the echo of her voice faded, he spoke quietly, with the Appalachian warmth returning to his tone like heat returning to a room. "Congresswoman, let me tell you about someone," he said, speaking from memory rather than the folder. Her name was Mama Bonnie Vance, and she was born in the hollers of eastern Appalachia, where the roads were dirt and the houses lacked indoor plumbing. She left at 13, walking out of those hills with nothing, no money, no diploma, no connections, and no plan. She arrived in Middletown, Ohio, got a job in a factory, married a man who drank too much, and raised children who struggled. She was a refugee, congresswoman, not from a war zone but from poverty, from a place America had forgotten, and she came to Middletown hoping for a chance. It gave her a factory job and a small house and public schools for her grandchildren, and the freedom to say whatever she wanted about the government. And you know what she did with that chance. She said thank you every day. Not to a politician or a party, but to the country. She flew an American flag outside her house and argued with the television news every night, loving every minute of it, because she knew that the country that gave her a chance was the greatest on earth. She never sat in Congress or gave a speech at CARE. She died in 2005 while I was deployed to Iraq. But if she were here, she would say this country saved your life, so act like it. The hearing room fell into the silence of 50 people understanding they were watching two American stories collide, Middletown and Mogadishu. It was a collision not about policy, but about something older, about whether the right response to being saved is gratitude or grievance. "You and I both came from nothing," Vance said. "We both know what hunger feels like and what it is like to be a child who doesn't know if the adults will be there tomorrow. I put on a uniform and went to Iraq and came home to write a book about the place I came from, not to tear it down, but to understand it. Every morning, I wake up grateful that I live in the only country on earth that would have given a kid with a drug-addicted mother the chance to become vice president. You came here as a 12-year-old girl with nothing, and this country gave you safety, citizenship, education, and a seat in the United States Congress. From that seat, you called the worst attack on American soil, 'Some people did something,' and compared our military to the Taliban. You authored a bill that created a massive fraud pipeline in your own community, and when the Treasury Department investigated terrorism funding, you blamed the FBI. Congresswoman, I am not questioning your right to be here or your religion, but I am questioning what you did with the gift of being here. America doesn't ask for gratitude, and you can criticize this country from morning to night. But there is a line between criticism and contempt. When you describe the murder of nearly 3,000 people as something and blame the people investigating fraud instead of those who stole the money, you have crossed that line. The saddest part is that the people who pay the price are the Somali Americans in Cedar Riverside who are now associated with a fraud they had nothing to do with. It is the Muslim Americans who cringe every time you make a statement that confirms stereotypes, and the immigrants who took the citizenship oath with tears in their eyes. He looked at her one last time, noting two kids who grew up with nothing and were given everything by the same country. Yet one said thank you and one said some people did something. I yield to the committee, he said, and Omar stood while pulling away from her attorney to say, you don't get to tell an immigrant how to feel about this country. You don't get to weaponize your poverty against mine or use your grandmother's story to silence a refugee. And I will not be lectured by a man who blames poor people for being poor. Vance's response was 6 words. I am not telling you how to feel. I am reading what you said. I didn't write your tweets, or the Meals Act, or the comparison to the Taliban. You did, and the American people can decide what those words say about your relationship with the country that saved your life." The chairman brought the hearing to a close, and Omar gathered her papers without looking at them and walked out of the room without stopping for cameras. Her staff followed her down a hallway full of reporters, but she turned left and kept walking, having nothing to say to the press for the first time in her career. The clip traveled in fragments, optimized for different audiences, with the first fragment being the mama story, where Vance described his grandmother flying the flag. Someone found a photograph of the Vance house in Middletown, with the flag hanging from the porch, and shared it alongside Omar's clip with no commentary, because the juxtaposition was the commentary. The second fragment was the closing statement that America deserves better than contempt, which garnered 62 million views in 48 hours. It was printed on T-shirts and quoted in sermons, and painted on a mural in Scranton, becoming the most repeated sentence in the country for a brief period. The third fragment, which did damage Omar's team hadn't anticipated, was the response from immigrants, starting with a Vietnamese-American woman in Orange County who recorded a video. She was 71 years old and had come to America in a fishing boat with 37 other people, speaking with an accent and tears in her eyes. She said she knew what it meant to be a refugee, having spent 3 weeks on the ocean without food, and declared that when Omar says, "Some people did something," she does not speak for her. The video was viewed 14 million times, followed by a Cuban-American professor in Miami, whose parents fled Castro, and who wrote an op-ed about his mother kissing the ground at the airport. Gratitude was not optional in our house. It was the foundation of everything, and a Nigerian-American surgeon in Houston posted that she cried during her oath because she remembered the village she came from. A Gold Star mother from New Jersey, whose son died in Afghanistan, gave an interview holding a photograph of him in his dress blues, saying, "My boy died because of what some people did." The immigrant response became its own phenomenon, not organized or partisan, coming from Vietnamese and Cuban and Nigerian and Mexican Americans who remembered what they left behind. They were furious, not at Vance, but at the idea that Ilhan Omar spoke for them, and that her contempt was their contempt. "She makes us just look ungrateful," said a Somali-American shopkeeper in Omar's own neighborhood, adding that, "We are not ungrateful, and we came here because we love this country." Omar held a press conference 4 hours after the hearing, flanked by squad members, calling the event the most Islamophobic display of hatred she had witnessed. She called Vance a man who uses the vice presidency to bully immigrants, and called the mama story emotional manipulation. But she did not address "some people did something." She did not address the Taliban comparison, or the $250 million, or the immigrant responses, and by the time the press conference aired, 60 million people had already watched the mama clip. The Islamophobia defense encountered a structural problem because the man on the other side was not a wealthy Yale Republican, but a kid from Middletown who wore Goodwill shoes. He had climbed out of poverty the same way immigrants do, by working and serving. And when he spoke about gratitude, he spoke from the same place Omar spoke from when she talked about suffering. You can call a rich man's patriotism privilege, but when a man tells you he wore second-hand shoes and thanks America anyway, you can only call it a choice. The hearing was fundamentally about that choice, and in the weeks that followed, the word ungrateful attached itself to Omar like a lens through which everything she said was viewed. It wasn't a word Vance had used, as he was too disciplined and had used contempt, but the public translated it into the sharper word because it connected to something real. It highlighted the gap between what America had given Ilhan Omar and what she had given back, leaving her as a woman who had been given everything and thanked no one. This happened not because Vance insulted her identity, but because he told two stories and placed them next to hers to let America see the difference. Two poverties, two chances, two choices, one flag on a porch in Middletown, one tweet that said, "Some people did something," and a country deciding whether the right response to being saved is to say, "Thank you."